Hello, welcome. Today I'll be doing something a little different than regular gaming streams. We'll be taking a look at castles and their features, and at the end we'll also take a look at some real historical examples of some castles, mainly from Czech Republic. So I compiled most of the things that I found out in sort of PowerPoint presentation, but I will be switching the slides manually. Don't want it to run. So okay, so this is the initial picture. You can see this is a fairly well-developed castle, probably from high medieval period. Don't exactly know which one this is, but you can see its defensive features are a long bridge with a big moat, very powerful defensive feature, big gatehouse with some flanking towers on either side. One of the things to mention is that these towers usually stick out from the battlements, and that is for the sole purpose of being able to shoot with arrow fire in here, because otherwise if the tower was basically the same level as the wall, you wouldn't be able to see there. So that might be a problem. That is the reason why the towers are offset usually. Same with the gatehouse actually. So if somebody would, for example, take a ladder and put it here, wanted to climb up, then you would be able to throw stuff or shoot at him from this position or here, or these windows on the side. These are not actually windows, they are arrow slits. You wouldn't be able to fit through them. That is also very important in castle design, and usually you don't see that in castles that have been reworked extensively in later periods after medieval. That is because usually people want a lot of light, and so when they repurposed the castles, they actually included larger windows and things like that, so it really defeats the purpose. But at the time it was not actually like in 16th, 17th century, the defensive features of the castle were no longer viable for the weapons at the time, so that's the reason why they did it. Take a look at this. So this is an example of Roman fortifications. These were basically the precursor of castles. You can also think of any like ancient civilizations that have defensive works, but the main thing is that I do not include city defenses in this, because city defenses are actually another topic. So in this example, the top left, you can see there is a watchtower. And the watchtower is itself fortified. It usually has like a door, it has a stone foundation, it is mainly wood, and its reason was mostly to either set up like a checkpoint area that you would have few soldiers garrisoned, and they could either collect tolls or they could patrol the surrounding area. But it does not fit a definition of castle, because the definition of a castle is actually that it is a fortified residence of someone who is permanently living there, which is not the case with soldiers who are stationed in such an outpost, which is for the reason that they would be set to like a rotation and they do not own the watchtower in question, but rather the Roman Empire would station troops there and then rotate them out and set a task for them to do. So that is very different. So even though if this would, for example, be in medieval period, this watchtower, and somebody would live in it and he would be owning the land around it, it would definitely be considered a castle. But since it's considered like we are looking at it from the perspective of Romans, it is not a castle. On the right, you can see this is a late Roman military camp, and it is a permanent one. You can see they mostly dug a ditch around, see many buildings inside, or gatehouses. They usually did that. They wanted to have multiple access points into the camp, and this would also fit the purpose of a castle in medieval period, but same thing as with the watchtower. The soldiers there were actually either not owning the land, and they were not living there permanently. Usually after their service was done, they just went back to their life, or they could like get land from the state. So in this case, this is also not a castle, even though it certainly would be considered one in medieval period if somebody was living in it and had its own garrison. So it's kind of strange how that works, but something to keep in mind. On the left side, on the lower side, you can see this is the entrance to a Roman castrum, which is a military encampment. So Romans actually built like extensive fortifications from stone. You can see that it's quite big. They also have windows, but they are not on the lower level for the defensive purposes, and they are used for either throwing stuff out at the attackers or shooting. It's not perfect, like many of these things could be improved, especially with the knowledge of medieval period where people actually like considered many things how to properly defend a castle. So Romans actually built their fortifications mostly on flat land. They preferred open battle, so if they were attacked by an army, they usually preferred to sally out of the defenses, and defending the camp was like a last resort sort of operation for them. They did not prefer defensive warfare in that case, but some generals, like for example Julius Caesar, actually made use of defensive works extensively in his campaigns in the Gaul. So if you read his recollection of Gallic wars, you can actually like visualize most of the battles and how he did use the terrain to his advantage, and sometimes he built a fortified encampment which also had like towers and ditches, everything like that, right from there. But it's very different from a regular like castle entrance. Even the towers, you can notice that they are square, and usually square shape is not ideal for a castle because it usually offers a blind spot. If this tower was round, it would be much more difficult to just get somebody in here and place a ladder. Of course, you can have someone to throw something at them or defend from the wall here, but it's not as efficient as if you are defending from an enclosed building, just because of protection. So the square foundations are usually not prevalent in medieval designs, at least not high medieval designs. On the right you can see how some of the towers looked like. You can see that their towers actually sometimes were rounded in the front, but they were flat in the back. So that was for structural stability and ease of construction. And yeah, some of this showcases how might have Roman fortifications looked like. This could be fortification around a city, for example. Rome itself had extensive fortifications. So these are like precursors to medieval period Roman castrum, watchtower, and these defensive features. Next up, we will look at something that is like that drives the point, and that is what is actually considered a castle, even though it's much smaller than what the Romans built. These are some examples of very tiny towers that are built, but they are fortified residences. Somebody was living in them and owned the land, so they are in technicality a castle, even though they definitely do not offer as much protection as some of the Roman ones. They are still a castle. So a bunch of these are actually in Great Britain. In the border between Scotland and England, you have all sorts of these small towers. Usually it would be the case that like impoverished nobleman would be living in there with like 4 or 5 of his retainers and perhaps some serfs. So if you imagine like some of the castles were actually really not that well defended, but even if outnumbered significantly, if the castle had all the defensive features, it could actually hold out against much larger force. But the main purpose of the castle was not to hold out indefinitely, because that is very uncommon. Usually you would need a stable source of water inside, then you would need to protect yourself against all the sorts of things that the attacker might try and do, and then you would need to stockpile significant food supplies, and nothing lasts forever, so any castle can be conquered with any amount of effort, so it just takes longer for some of them. But their main purpose was not to hold the enemy indefinitely, but rather force the enemy to take a lot of time and resources to actually conquer it. which would allow your other allies, or if the nobleman was part of a kingdom, so the invading army could be attacked from another army. For example, the famous Battle of Agincourt was actually fought between French and English during the 100 Years' War, and it was a result of one siege like this, where English were actually besieging a bunch of castles in France, but they took too long, and French were able to, in the meantime, mass up significant army, and they were pursuing them and eventually caught up with them. Of course, the battle didn't go their way, but they outnumbered the English, so they thought they were in a good position. So that was the peak example of how that worked. Anything can be conquered, but it's about how much effort and resources it will take to actually do it. Take a look at another slide. So these are some considerations of like defenses. Some of them might be of natural like origin, because some of the castles, like even the Roman ones, when you go back, they would actually be having ditches around them, and they would be preferably built like on a slightly raised land, so that you can have a height advantage. But on medieval castles, people usually did not have access to the extensive labor force as the Roman Empire did. So just raising land would be very, very labor intensive, and it would cost a lot. So instead, what people opted to do is often use the natural terrain to their advantage and build a castle in such a spot. So if we take a look at the left, they did build a ditch, and they did make it more deep, but usually there would be like something of a cliff or something here, so they wouldn't have to do everything. Ditches like this are very useful. They were actually used in many castles because this allows enemies from easily approaching the walls, which is very good. Not only it completely negates like siege towers, but it also impedes ladder movement. If you were to imagine like bringing a massive ladder to the walls, it would be very, very difficult if you were to scale down this ditch first and while under constant barrage. So another thing to note is with actual escalade, which is a term for going up a wall of a castle with a ladder. It actually usually was not that easy. As you might imagine, if you were to arrive at a castle with an army and then you need to figure out how to make the ladder in the first place, it needs to be of a correct height, and usually you do not have in the medieval period especially like tools to very correctly measure the length of the wall, which might result in some pretty interesting circumstances where you would build the ladder and it would be slightly too short, so you wouldn't be able to reach over the parapet. So that certainly happened at some point in some sieges. Or you might build the ladder too high and then the enemy would push it very easily. Ideally, you would want the ladder to be able to reach just below the parapet, so it's not easily reachable by people on the actual battlement, but you would be able to climb over very easily. So in this example on the right, we can see that this castle was actually built into a cliffside, so this makes this entire side basically impervious. Another interesting thing about building a castle on a high ground is that it offers fairly good protection against all sorts of projectiles. There is a wild misconception that I need to debunk as well. Many people actually have the impression that people in medieval period used catapults, but that is not correct. Catapults were used in ancient warfare, usually like big massive torsion engines which could bring them on a wall, but in the medieval period people did not have the technology or the resources or even like the engineering skill to build machines of such scale and power. So they usually only used small torsion engines like mangonels, which would be capable of hurling a rock that would be as big as perhaps a watermelon, and they could knock out individual merlons on the crenellations. We'll explain these terms a little later. but they would not be able to take down a whole thick castle wall or a battlement, so they usually needed to scale the walls or conquer a gatehouse, which would allow the access to the walls. That's why the castles were actually like they worked. That's why people built them, because it was not easy to conquer them. Hey Kane, welcome. Yeah, cannons, but we are not focusing on later periods just yet. That's perhaps for another time, if people are interested in topics such as this. It's definitely, the warfare changed a lot once the cannons were actually introduced, especially the rifled ones, but for medieval period we are mostly focusing on the early to high medieval period, so late medieval where there were actually starting to see some cannons. We are not considering that. There were engines that could damage a wall over a significant period of time, especially in high medieval period. For example, the counterweight trebuchet, which could hurl larger rocks over a big distance, that could under over several days, weeks, reduce a castle wall, and they could make a single breach. But that would still not be a victory, since the breach itself would be fairly tight, so it could be defended fairly effectively, and defenders usually piled up rubble and closed the breach during the night. Sappers are introduced. Well, if you think about the definition of sapper, it's a dedicated specialist for dealing with siege warfare, right? Or like combat engineer, basically, because they were used in field fortifications as well sometimes. Those were introduced basically in ancient times, when civilizations had the power to, in the time where there was the early Bronze Age, that people were growing a lot of food, there were a lot of surpluses, and civilizations could support more and more people to focus on warfare and also defensive works. They actually needed to develop something to counter these defenses, and what they came up with usually was large amounts of sappers. They would try to sap the walls either by digging under them or even directly chipping at them. The ones who dug tunnels to blow up tunnels with gunpowder. Yeah, that was late medieval period, where the buried charges were used, and usually they were also used in defense, when they would be dug in the ground near the castle or the fortress where the enemy would be expected to approach from, and then after the enemy marches over it, they would blow it up, right? So in field battles, if they know that the battle is going to take place in a certain field, for example, they could also do this. They could arrive at the scene a little earlier and prepare buried charges that they would detonate once the enemy marches over them. So it was quite devastating, but this use of gunpowder was not used early. I think it was late medieval period, Renaissance and onward. Okay, so on the left side we can see in the lower picture, this is there is a ditch and a hill, and the castle is built on top of it, so it offers the maximum height advantage. You can also see what we talked about earlier with the enfilading towers, which means flanking towers. They are sticking out of the battlement, so they can actually see along this wall, because if you would imagine people standing by the wall, it is not easy to shoot at them while you were standing on the wall itself, unless you are willing to lean forward, which is very dangerous, not only because you can get shot yourself, but also because the stability would not be great. You would probably need another guy to just hold you while you lean forward a lot to see here and shoot. So this is how the defenses were actually incorporated to cover each other's weaknesses. On the right side, we can see that there is a castle with a giant moat. So this is a very, very good defense, because at this time, as I mentioned before, people were not able to make very powerful engines that could knock down walls or towers very easily. So the approach points are basically blocked off, which means enemy would need to somehow drain the water or even fill in the moat, or construct some sort of a very giant raft or something to approach the walls, and then there would be the whole entire castle to conquer. So it adds extra layer of inconvenience Go to the next slide. So now we get into the defenses in question. On the left side on the top you can see a gatehouse, and this is actually not a gatehouse. Gatehouse is the structure that the gate is built into, and this was called portcullis, and usually they were made from wood or iron or metal. You can see this lower part is iron and then it's wooden. It blocks off approaching enemies. It could be also incorporated with, if you drop down this portcullis, then you would have a massive door behind it. But things like this are not impervious, especially to things like fire. So usually what would happen is the gatehouse would be considered like the weakest point in the defenses. So the people who designed the castle would actually try to incorporate the gatehouses in such a fashion as to not open up many opportunities for enemies to approach very easily, or like run into the whole area just by conquering a single piece of wall. Hey McCain. Yeah, they are. So the portcullis is like a temporary measure for stopping the enemies when they approach the castle, want to besiege it. They might try to launch like a surprise attack, so you can drop down the portcullis. But if the enemy is approaching the wall with mantlets or shields, then they would be able to either use the battering ram to crack it, but even more prevalent thing that is usually undermentioned in popular media is they would just set it on fire. They would bring like pitch or tar, they would slather it with tar and they would light it on fire. Hey Baron, welcome. And what would happen, even if the portcullis was made from metal, it would crack and be brittle. So you could break it up easily with some force and then you would be through. The doors would not be too different, they would use the same sort of strategy. But after you are into the gatehouse, there wouldn't be like a staircase directly to the right which would lead to the door. Instead, this would all be flat, the walls. And on top, on the ceiling, you would have which is called murder holes. And these murder holes are just an opening in the ceiling which allows people in the actual guardhouse that would be on top of the gatehouse to drop down stuff or shoot through those holes, and disallow people from easily breaking the second gate that would be behind that. So you would have portcullis, usually a gate, and then another gate which would be like door from exit from the gatehouse into the bailey behind it. Famous, yeah, murder holes from Age of Empires 2 are actually supposed to be called maculations, but whatever. Murder holes are something very different. They were used just in gatehouses because when they are incorporated into walls, they are actually called something different, and we'll look into that in a moment. I have it prepared, but for now this is what is called murder holes. Then on the lower left side we have another flanking tower example. So they would be building the towers extended from the wall, from the battlement, and then it would be able to cover this wall because there is a blind spot otherwise. An idea for a stream? Yeah, definitely. I think I wanted to do this for quite some time, but it took me some time to put everything together and like think of the concept, think what I need to talk about, and there are so many things I need to like really not bloat it too much. And we need to also not rush through it because we are already through 4 slides here, so not great. So maybe in the hindsight I should have designed it a little longer, but this can be just an hour. I don't think we need to stretch it too long. Baron has redeemed an ancient or medieval era history fact. I go for it. Okay, not a problem, but since it's a redemption you can ask about something, or I can go back and at least show you the slides we had initially. So this was the initial slide, just introduction. Then we had Roman fortifications, so you can even watch the VOD if you really want. We talked about some Romans, so you might be interested in that, and we talked about why this is not a castle, this is not a castle. This is entirely different concept, because a concept of a castle is that it actually is a fortified permanent residence, and these were not, because usually soldiers stationed there were paid for a certain period and they would be rotated out. even a commander would not be permanently residing in a fortified encampment, which means that it does not fit a purpose of a castle, a definition of a castle, even though the defenses were quite extensive. But on the other hand, you have like these small towers, and they are a castle because they are in the medieval period, people lived in them, and therefore it fits the definition. Yes. Exactly. So it's kind of strange, but if you had this watchtower, this Roman watchtower, and you would have this structure built in medieval Europe, somebody would probably go, hey, that's a cool place, I could call home and move right in, and at that point it would become a castle. Because that's how the definition works. It's kind of strange, but is there a good word for the hrad instead of using the same as for kastel? Czech word for castle is hrad. Not sure if you meant, I think you are from Hungary, right? So your word for castle is kastel. All the words have very similar meaning. I think they are from the same word. Most of them castile or castrum from Latin. So same distinction as Hungarian, yes, var castelli. Okay. So then we took a look at this. So moats were very prevalent, very effective defensive measure. We talked about how games like Stronghold and even popular media actually depict medieval sieges very wrongly, in that there were no catapults that could knock down a massive wall. It would take us months until you can make even a small breach in the walls. So that's the reason why the castles had elaborate designs, and they were actually mazed. Like when you saw me play Stronghold, it's actually how the castles were designed to funnel enemies in a certain direction because they couldn't break through the walls easily. And escalate, which is a term for using ladders to climb a wall, were very dangerous operations. It was very, very dangerous. Like a falling stone, even peasant could haul a big stone on the wall and then throw it down, and it could kill an armored knight with the best available equipment in one shot. So you can imagine noblemen especially were not very excited in rushing in escalates. It's common to have multiple terms anyway. I think Berg, effort, yeah. Yeah, so we ended up here. So we talked about the flanking towers again. So you can see in this example, again, the flanking towers, they are offset from the battlements and they cover each other's weaknesses. Then on the right, you can see these are actually more akin to the Roman tower, since the backside is flat and the front side is curved. And the curve is there for easily able to shoot at the foot of the tower, because if it was square, it would offer more dead angles. And that is not great for coverage of the defenses. So in the right side, you can see the defenses were sometimes very, very extensive. But in this example, it's actually quite vulnerable castle. This is probably a defense around a city rather than a castle, just because castles were usually built on a mountain or something, because you don't want to defend the entire area, rather you want to offer as little as possible and then defend the points and make them impervious to all sorts of attempts. So more wall you need to cover means you need bigger garrison, you need more resources to defend it. Then we go into this. So this is very, very basic stuff, but it's very important. So this is on the top left, you can see a picture of crenellations. Crenellations are a term that refers to the defenses on the battlements, and they are composed of two different things, parts. Merlons are the sticking out parts, the teeth, if you would imagine. And the crenel is called the gap between them, which would be used to shoot out of the battlements. And they are not perfect, since they don't offer usually a way to shoot down. So you still would need to lean forward if you want to shoot at somebody at the foot of the wall. But they are very good for protection. And since you mentioned mangonels would actually be able to knock down individual merlons or even take down a single person or something like that, but they would not be able to knock down a whole wall. So crenellations, expensive to make, but very useful for defense. If you have just a flat wall, it's very dangerous because enemy will be able to shoot at you very, very effectively from the low ground, especially if they use like portable shields or mantlets, anything like that. On the right side, we can see what is called a machicolation. Machicolation is, you can see that there is a battlement with crenellations, and then there is like it's offset from the wall. And then there are these holes, which are similar to murder holes on the gatehouse, but they are very different since they are mostly on all the vulnerable spots. And you can use them to throw stuff down directly at people at the wall or shoot down. The house I grew up in actually had decorative crenellations on top, strange piece of indesical aesthetics. Yeah, that's also a thing to mention. People after the medieval period, like Renaissance and even Victorian era, I think people, especially in England, actually put crenellations on top of their, like, some of their mansions just for aesthetics. But at medieval period, when they were actually useful, there was a decree from king in England that you couldn't just put crenellations on any structure, so you needed to get like a permit from the king. So yeah, machicolation very, very useful, but they are not so prevalent because they are very expensive to make, and not all countries like use them extensively. For example, here in Czech Republic, instead of machicolations, people actually used hoardings instead, and that's what's directly under it. And hoardings are the wooden structures that are built on top of walls. They would not be present at all times usually. They would be prepared in case the enemy army was approaching. You would usually have some sort of intelligence, so you would stockpile rations, you would make sure that everything is ready, and you would construct hoardings. And the hoardings would be built on top of the crenellations and offset to the front, so that you can have machicolations in the wooden floor. Much cheaper and useful, but it offers its own set of weaknesses. So nothing is perfect. On the left side, you can see what is called a turret. Turret is a small tower that's sticking out of a different structure. It does not have its own like footprint. It doesn't have its own like part touching the ground, but rather it's built on top of a keep or a big tower donjon, and it would be sticking out. It's good for flanking fire, and also it's just another spot. If you would imagine you would have few archers on the wall, it's usually better if you have them spread around, so the enemy does not have like a mass to shoot into, but rather have them spread so that you need to watch out for multiple angles. It makes it more difficult. Something to mention as well, since we are talking about this, might be that in terms of defense and even an offense, basically using bows or crossbows would be very different, because with bow you need to draw the arrow, and until you release it you cannot hold it indefinitely, so you would most likely just need to make sure that you see an enemy, then you would take out an arrow, then you would draw the bow, and if the enemy, for example, changes position or something, ducks behind something, then you would either not release the arrow or you would shoot anyway. And that's pretty bad. While as with crossbows, you can actually like draw the bolt in, and then you would conserve the power in the actual mechanism, and then you would be ready with the bolt, and then you would wait until enemy pops out, and then you would immediately shoot him. So that would be much more useful in terms of defense, especially if there was, even when you were besieging a castle, you would have a big crossbow, and then you would wait until somebody's head pops out of the individual crenels, then you would be able to shoot between them and take them out easily, more easily than with a bow, unless you are very, very skilled, of course. Okay, so next up, let's take a look at some other features. So this, just to mention, is the biggest tower in a castle would be called donjon, and it would usually serve the purpose of a keep, which would be the main fortified structure. The main tower would be where most of the living quarters of the noble would be kept, and usually even a storehouse at the basement or armory, things like that. So even if the castle was partially taken, it could still hold out in the final redoubt. On the right you can see an example with a donjon being a keep. It is a big square tower, so it's still a donjon, but it is in technicality a keep. In this example, it would probably not be great for defense if this is accessible, just because if enemy gains access to any part of the wall or goes through the gatehouse, they would actually be able to go through here. But it doesn't look like there is a door, so the defenses are properly set up. You don't want enemies to be able to immediately enter the main area, so you would keep it separate, so that they need to break additional layer of defenses before they are able to completely gain control of the castle. On the lower left side you can see an example of Conway Castle in Wales, and this is its footprint on the right. And you can see that not all castles actually had donjons or keeps. These 4 towers are actually turrets, and these towers, there are 8 of them, they are all the same height. And they are basically if you were to approach this castle, you don't know which tower is the most important. Some of them had living quarters, some of them had kitchens, some of them had storehouses, things like that. So it's interesting how some of the castles were built without the main defensive features. They would not have the biggest, tallest tower. That would be very easy to be identified as the main defense. So it would be fairly hard to get yourself, know what you need to take out first. Let's take a look at Motte Bailey Castle. So it's basically the definition. You have the motte, which is like the keep, and Bailey is the courtyard. And the courtyard usually featured buildings that would be like blacksmith, stable, storehouse, kitchen, servants' quarters, garrison quarters, chapel, things like that. And then the actual keep would be where the noble would live, and probably feature an armory and a storehouse. You can see that it was usually built on a hill and then a slightly lesser hill, which would have the bailey itself. There were actually examples of castles which had multiple baileys, multiple of these courtyards connected together, where it would be separated into even more of different layers. So you need to punch through to gain access to the main area, which wouldn't be very easy. Take a look at this. So this is a layout of a castle. You can see that they actually used the mazes. On this side the castle is defended by rough terrain, so they had defenses along here with a gatehouse here. And if somebody would gain access to here, he would still have to go through these paths, which are open to fire from all the different angles, which is not easy to do. Normans often constructed artificial hills and formed and Bailey castles, which they used to control England after conquest. Yeah, that is true, but it was not. They were usually not very big castles, because just the labor necessary to make the giant hill that we would need to make, it's very, very hard. But they did that. That is correct. Yeah, you can see all the various defenses, but this castle was usually it looks like it was repurposed later, since you can see a whole bunch of windows that would not be present in medieval period, and this central thing is probably where the donjon was. Cheap castles, they could make a lot of them. Yep. Now let's take a look at the layout of another castle. So you would have gatehouses on either side, looks like. A bunch of these castles, the thick walls would be called battlements, while the walls which would not have a passage through them, like in the middle of the wall, would be called curtain walls. These small towers could be no, they are towers, they are not turrets, since they are not sticking out of something else. But they are layered defenses, so if they were to be able to breach this layer, they would still have the entire other area to breach. Not easy at all. But this one looks like it has been, like it did not survive through time very well, so not sure what was the deal with it, if it was burned down, conquered, or if just the time took its toll on it. Now we'll take a look at some castles in Czech Republic. So this is a Karlštejn castle, probably the most famous one. It is built in very hilly terrain, and you can see that it has these separate like courtyards, baileys. So there is one, this is another one. When these types of castles fall out of use during the 16th century, because cannons and mortars and all sorts of gunpowder weapons became more and more viable. So it was very hard to defend against that with structures such as these, just because a cannon could very easily punch through a curtain wall with just several volleys, unless the wall was very, very thick. But even if it was thick and high, it would still be breached, and with much less effort than with medieval siege weapons. Yeah, they switched to star forts. Basically, it made the walls be lower with incorporated cannon batteries, and then they would have like piled up dirt in the middle of them. Yeah, all about them thick walls. It's not just about thickness though, they needed to make them low against the cannon, because that's the profile which made them vulnerable. Yeah, so you can see in the Karlštejn castle you have all sorts of these buildings. This is servants' quarters, kitchen, storehouses, garrison quarters, and then the main tower. And this is a treasury, I think, because it was a castle constructed by famous king, so he made the castle as a state treasure as well, I believe. Yeah, the star forts are still... I can believe that we have several of them in Czech Republic as well. But the star forts were viable during 16th, 17th century, but during Napoleonic Wars the new doctrine actually like switched from extensive siege warfare and went for field battles instead. So the forts were usually bypassed, so they didn't serve much use after that. Next up, this is Křivoklát castle. Yeah, that makes sense. It was probably founded in the period, right? So if it was a main settlement, they would probably make a fortress in the middle, just to control the surrounding area. It's interesting how every time somebody talks about medieval period and castles, there are people who start to mention like completely different period with entirely different defensive elements and offensive elements. It's just so different. This is like comparing stick and stones to missiles. This is something totally different. You cannot compare the two, and the talks about these things need to be kept for a separate like topic. Sorry for that. Go back. Okay, so this is Křivoklát castle. Křivoklát castle is also built in the forest. There are also cliffs here, so it's inaccessible from this side. That's why you will see all sorts of these buildings which do not have their own battlements. They are just hugging the side. And then there are walls where there is actual approach point. That is from here. This is where all the enemies would need to approach from, unless they were somehow able to climb this. But even if they are able to climb it, they will not be able to scale the walls very effectively. Ladder is a big thing if you need it to be as big to reach these sorts of levels. So there is a bailey after that. There is actually, behind this tower, there is another gatehouse from this side. You can maybe see a sticking out roof there. That's a gatehouse, and then you would need to break through here, this courtyard, and then this main area. There is a donjon, which featured the main quarters and armory. And also the castles themselves usually did not have all the buildings inside the courtyards because it was not easy to fit everything and you needed to keep the design as minimalistic as possible. So all the various peasants would be living in the background. Even in the current day there is actually a village down by the castle. So that's how the things worked. Poor people usually lived around, they weren't included. Then we have Coast Castle, and this one is built on a big cliff. You can see that. Hey Frankie, welcome. Yeah, the trees would not be there, but they would still keep some of them, like here on the hill, because the hill itself would be inaccessible. There is a big cliff in there. It's just not visible because of all the trees. So they would clean an area, like 50 yards maybe from the walls, but keep the rest. Because there is no use. You just want to keep like a kill zone right next to the wall so you can actually defend them if somebody manages to get there, but it's not a priority if you have the natural features. Like on the Coast Castle, you can see that somebody scaling this with any amount of like strength left to do anything is very like impossible. You cannot do it, so that's why they chose places like this. You would need to go around. This would probably be scalable, but also this is not easy to climb with a ladder, so it would still not be easy. So you would need to break through the gatehouse most likely, and the gatehouses had murder holes and all the different defensive features, so that's why they were useful, that's why they were used. Also a dungeon. Most of the castles actually feature one. This roof is not historically accurate. They had a larger one, but I think some of the castles are actually a victim of fires in the past, so that's why some of the things are rebuilt. Even these roofs are not historical. These servants' quarters looks like they are whitewashed with like engravings. It's very common to do with white plaster, and then it is called graffito, which means that there would be craftsmen who specialize in craft of they would make the walls coated in different layers of whitewash with different colors, and then they would use tools to scrape through them to make the patterns of different color. Whitewashed castle walls were actually quite common. You don't see it much on castles nowadays, but they were usually whitewashed, like the tower you can see here, or this building. They were usually not having exposed stone like this, if they could afford the work. But if you afforded a castle in the first place, you would not not be able to afford that. Also very important, castles were usually found around a body of water. You would also want a well inside, so that water is the most basic need. This is Trotsky Castle. No, actually, it's quite silly, I don't know the name of this one, but it's also in Czech Republic, and it's built on a massive hill. These sorts of castles were either a nobleman's home, but usually also founded and funded by crown, just to secure trade routes and secure the land, because you needed to have like centers of government presence, because otherwise people would go, like bandits would go rampant. So we needed to have garrisons stationed throughout the land to be able to summon them if there was a significant problem, not just an invading army, but also for public order reasons. And also collection of taxes, everything like that needed to be done in a proper place, because you needed to keep it safely locked away. This is Trotsky Castle. It is built on two cliffs. You can see this tower built on this rugged cliff. This is like a big example of how to make it very defensible. That's why they managed to get away with square towers, probably, because they didn't need to defend all the sides, so just building a structure like as simple as possible was viable. Bunch of walls down here from the access point. Again, you would need to go through the freaking maze to get anywhere, and then the towers themselves would contain the valuable things or the important parts of the castle. Usually they would also feature, in the modern day, they have like a steel railing here, but in the medieval period they would have wooden bridges that they would definitely set on fire once the enemies breached the lower area. They would actually set the bridge on fire and it would burn down, and there was no accessible point to the main area, so the enemies could often not breach the final place, so they would either move on, be forced to move on by another army, or they would just abandon the siege. This is an aerial shot. It's not very good, but it gives you this idea of the scope of the castle. This one is Rabi Castle. So again, you can see some basic like peasant buildings in the courtyard, and then the inner courtyard, which has the donjon or a keep, and important things locked away behind a second stage set of walls. This side inaccessible again, so the enemies would need to come through here. This is actually a castle that's not from Czech Republic. This is a castle called Krag des Chevaliers, and it's in Middle East, and it was the biggest Crusader castle ever constructed. Some of it survives to this day. You can see that it's not in a very good shape, but it is still there. So there are some structures, yeah, Syria. These are, there are some structures that were probably added a little later, since the Arabs actually reconquested their lands, so they actually claimed this. But it's interesting that this castle actually has like land filled up area. It might be a natural feature which is just encased in walls, but it strengthens the walls themselves against siege. If you were somehow able to breach the walls, then it was still not possible to just run in. You would be facing a whole lot of rubble and dirt. Yep, it was even more badly damaged in a recent war, because they actually targeted historical things as well, among which was Krag des Chevaliers, even though it did not fit their, like they had their justifications for damaging things that were like very old, because they wanted to destroy anything that was older than Islam. So this was not older than Islam, this was built by Crusaders, so there wasn't a reason to do it. Maybe it was damaged during like real warfare rather than just savagery, but yeah, it's very possible. And I think that's it. I don't think I have any more currently, but that should give you like a basic idea what the castles were all about. And go through the pictures again. Next time we might feature maybe the 16th and 17th century warfare. No, I don't have formal history background. I was just interested in it from the point where I was actually able to like have hobbies. I was very interested in history. It was always my favorite subject at school, and after school I it's nothing like academic studies, but I try to follow up on all the things I can get my hands on and then glean some information from it, be it internet sources or even books, or even people around me who actually do have academic background. But it is very like basic. You have PhD in it, that's great. I hope there is some application to it though, because it's at least here it's usually not easy to find a job in a field. If it is something like history, you might end up teaching something completely different. Take a look at some of the pictures again. I like this one. The scope is just massive. If you would imagine constructing this by hand, like it took a significant effort. There is actually a group of enthusiasts in France that actually tried to construct a real castle in modern day France using the medieval period construction techniques and materials without help of any modern day stuff. And they actually managed to do it. But it took them a lot of work for making a smaller castle. medieval history is very cool, but never got much coursework into it. Yeah, it might be also because like North American countries did not have the medieval history like here. The history surrounds you so much that it's unavoidable, basically. So when usually kids are interested in it, so that leads to people being interested in it. Nowadays you work in the private sector for the dollars. Yeah, it makes sense. Yep. Check it out, definitely. The how is it called? The castle. I don't remember the name. It's the like French group of volunteers who are constructing a medieval castle. If you type that into Google, it should spit out a result. So you can see the common theme with castles being built on top of hills mostly and in inaccessible places to minimize the defensible area, the area that you need to defend. And also because the scope of like population was not as large as during Roman times. Romans were able to get away with building on open ground because they had the manpower to defend everything they wanted and they preferred field battles. But during medieval period you would be lucky to get like garrison of 50 to 100 men, I think, in some of the smaller castles. So you would need to delegate your resources accordingly. You cannot defend everything at once. So reducing the area that you need to defend is very, very useful. Why they did it. And also it's like with the discussion about medieval armor and weapons, they would not invest such obscene amount of effort and money into making something that does not work. It worked, that's why they did it. Same with the castles. If you imagine how expensive it was to get this going, it was no small feat to get it done, and it needed to work. That's the only reason they did it. It was not for show. Some of the things might have been done for show, like the little things inside keeps, but usually the defensive features were designed for practicality rather than looks. Yeah, and armor as well. So that's probably going to be it for today, but I may be up with something else later. Let me know in the Discord if you like this like concept. I can make something like this for other topics as well. I think it's quite interesting. Even though I didn't put together too much things, I think at least a little basic look is good. At least for someone who knows very little, it might offer some insight into it. So yeah, I like it a lot. It's not gaming for once, so you don't need to play games all the time. At least I don't think so. So I would be definitely interested in doing something like this again. Let me take a look if there is somebody we could raid. There is Dark Young about. Let's raid him. Frankie actually sent a link. Yeah, this is it. That's the link for Godalon Castle, which is the castle built in France in modern day using medieval techniques by volunteers. Yeah. Thanks for that. So until next time, cheers.
Is die Irish dude?